some of these issues. We're going to hear now from Caerleon Safford from Fire Safe Sonoma. And I'll just quickly hand the floor over to you, Caerleon, for your presentation. And again, just a reminder to folks, feel free to write questions or reflections in the chat, and we'll move those to our speakers. Thanks.
So I know we're a little behind, so the first thing I'm going to have to say is that I'm going to be running through this pretty darn quick today. So I hope that we can give you a couple of like really important points to remember, but this is going to be so fast that it's going to be really hard to absorb the big pieces of the messages. I know that probably a lot of you who are in the room have heard my presentation before and will recognize several slides. But I really do, there's some really important basic things that I hope everybody knows about what they can do with their house and the immediate area around the house. It's really important to start there. And these slides might look vaguely familiar from Adriana's presentation. This has changed all of our worlds and how we think about it. Fire, when I started the 2016 Community Wildfire Protection Plan in the early 2000s, nobody was paying much attention to fire because we really hadn't had a fire in Sonoma County since really, you know, Creighton Ridge, which is in my neighborhood, was in 1978. But before that, the only one that had impacted the major population areas was the Hanley in 1964. So it was really hard to get people to believe that we even had any risk in Sonoma County. And boy, do we know that now, right? And again, these are leaving us with these concepts of just how big the problem is, which makes us feel hopeless. And really, there's so much about this problem that is not big, it's small. And specifically, I want to talk about, like, what is it that makes homes ignite during wildfires? Because, you know, fire, we tend to visualize it with those big, big images, like this thing that's going to come and get us out of the mountains and it's big and scary and horrible, which it is, don't get me wrong. But fire is just physics at the end of the day. And it's, you know, fire burns if there's something to burn. And much of the stuff that burns is to a greater or lesser degree within our control as residents. So you have direct flame contact. That's if you have especially low growing trees, brush and trees that are growing right up to your house. That can be a problem because it can transmit flame straight to the house. Radiant heat, not as common a cause of home ignition except for in tight neighborhoods, which Camp Meeker is. So you do have both radiant heat and direct risks, flame risks in Camp Meeker, but they are both issues that you can do something to mitigate the risk on your property. But the one that we're really, really, really worried about, and science has really let us know that this is the biggest issue, the biggest cause of home loss, are embers, which are very small, right? This is a classic example photo. There's nothing burning except for the barn here, right? None of the grass is burned up to it. This grass is probably burning because the barn caught it on fire. But these embers are blowing around at like snow in a snowstorm during a fire. And embers burn roughly, the initial cause of ignition is about 80% of homes that burn because of ember exposure. So this is the one that we really need to get out of. And embers, I may point out, are not big. They are small. They are roughly the size of a pea, maybe a little bigger. Very, very small things, and they pile up against the house and they pile up on stuff near the house, so that even if the direct flame or the radiant heat is still far, far away, you're getting risk to your house because these little tiny embers are piling up around the house. So that is very much under the control of the homeowners to start working out how we can reduce those risks to embers. And the first guy to really sort of start talking about this a long time ago was this awesome fellow named Jack Cohen, who worked for the Forest Service. He's now retired, but Google his name. A lot of his videos on firewise.org's website, which are awesome. Everything he's done is really cool. And he came up with these three basic principles, which is that wildfire ignites homes due to vulnerabilities on the structure itself, the fuels within 100 feet, of the structure, especially within 30 feet of the structure. And of course, we've got to add the weather. The weather events we've been having in Sonoma County in the fall have a huge impact on what a fire is going to do. And the position on the slope. A slope, fire burns fast uphill, so if your house is on a steep slope up above where the fire is coming from, the risk is a little higher. So these are all things that you need to think about when you're starting to work on your defensible space. And I'd encourage you all to, where do those northeast winds come from? Where do they hit your house? When the wind is northeast, pay attention and do a little more work on that side. Start there when you're looking up to fix your ember problems and so on. So there's two basic principles. We got to harden the structures through construction stuff to make them resist ignition, and we have to decrease surrounding vegetation, which is vegetation management. It's the stuff we should all be doing. So this is the most important thing I'm going to tell you, and this is critical. You start at the house and you work outwards. And it's a very hard thing to do. Something about being right next to our house seems to trigger a fear response in our minds. And so I will catch myself going, okay, I'm going to go out and I'm going to work on that 5 feet on the northwest side of the house. That's all I'm going to do today. And I'll look up and I'm down at the bottom of the orchard, like far, far away. But you really need to start at the house at 5 feet from the house and work out as you're doing your work. It's absolutely critical to do that. And let me show you this video of what it is that those ember ignitions really look like. Oops, not that way, I'm not gonna. Let's see, let's go back. There we go. This is a kind of an old funky video, but it's a fire many years ago, Mariposa County. You can see here's the fire over here. Here's our firefighters. Whoa, yeah, look at that. You see that? That's a broom. That was a broom. Well, where was that broom? It was under a wooden deck that you can see up there, and it was surrounded by other stuff. There were chairs there. There was all kinds of flammable stuff there. So this fire that you see in the background may or may not have taken that house out, but that ember that ignited that broom absolutely would have taken that house out. And this is why I so want to emphasize the think small piece, because it's those little things that are going to put your property at risk to wildfire. And most of those things, a lot of those are really under your control. So my other hero, Dr. Steve Quarles, who works now for the UC Cooperative Extension, used to work for a company called the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, who's awesome and lives near us, which is very common, very handy for us. He came up, when he worked for the IBHS, he had an awesome lab where he could build a house on a turntable in a lab and set it on fire using various methods to do that. And so he was able to really test out where are the most vulnerable areas of the house. And he came up with these 6 priorities, which I'm going to run through in the next couple of slides. www.disastersafety.org is where a lot of his materials are, and they're awesome. So check that out. So your most vulnerable element is probably your roof. And the reason why roofs are so vulnerable is that they're a relatively flat surface where stuff can pile up. If you live in the redwoods, you know what I mean, those darn redwood, all those needles piling up on the roof. It's a problem. Now, a Class A roof is quite simply a roofing and the underlayment, it's a combination, that will withstand a burning brand, which is a box of wood, for an hour without burning through. That's what a Class A roof is. Comp shingle, which is what this roof is with the proper underlayment, can be a Class A material. Comp shingle, which is what most of us have, has a sell-by date, right? You buy a 25-year roof or a 40-year roof. If you have like this, a 25-year roof, but it's been up there for 40 years, that roof is no longer Class A. And that means that if stuff piles up on top of here, either embers or embers in combination with other flammable stuff, that's a lot of exposure to the house. So the roof is a really important element to get after. Tile roofs can be great. They can have vulnerabilities, like tile roofs must be bird stopped so no one can get under there. Birds will build nests underneath the tiles, and then you're not using the protection of the roof surface, you're actually exposing beneath that. Everybody always thinks that metal roofs are the end-all and be-all of roofing, and they're great. You need to make sure that the underlayment on that metal roof, in combination with the metal roofing on top, is Class A. So a metal surface by itself needs the proper underlayment to really be a Class A material. And it needs to be properly put together. Now this slide, I don't know if you can really see, there's a piece of metal roof over here. You can see it's a metal roof. But what you don't see up here is the roof cap. And so after years and years and years of exposure, all of these needles from the surrounding pine trees had filled up in those little interstices there. And this was the result. And this got caught because there were people there and they were able to put it out. But any roof becomes vulnerable if it's not constructed correctly or taken care of. But the real thing to watch out for is, like, this is probably a Class A roofing surface here. So if all of these leaves caught on fire, they're not going to burn through the roof itself, but they do cause exposure to the more vulnerable shingle wall that's around it. So if you have areas on your roof where you know that the redwood debris falls and piles up every year, one of the things you might want to think about if you don't have a Class A roof, get that done. But the other thing you can do is just do a non-combustible material for the bottom foot or so of your exposed walls that cause risk. So you can spot replace. You got to make sure and keep that as clean as you can all summer long, with the caveat that when the fire comes, the wind blows and it's all going to be back again, but you don't want 3 months worth of debris, you want a day's worth of debris. Well, most people I find don't know what their roof is. They have no idea what class it is or how long it's been up there. You can get a roofer to come out and do an inspection of that, and I would highly recommend that if you don't know. Gutters are also really vulnerable. They can, if they fill up with debris, they expose the roof at the most vulnerable part, which is right at the edge of the roof. So make sure that your gutters either get some gutter guards to keep the stuff out of them. Make sure those are non-flammable gutter guards, which are on the market. You have to look for them. And take a look at your roof to make sure there's a metal drip edge installed at the edge of the roof where the plywood decking that the roof is on top of sits. That's really important too.
Just have a few minutes left, Caerleon.
Okay, I'm going to go really fast. Look at your vents. Vents used to be 1/4-inch mesh, so most of the vents that go into your attic and your foundation are going to have a 1/4-inch hole in them, which is way big enough for embers to get through. You can either quickly retrofit it by using smaller mesh and just putting it over your old mesh, or you can buy some pretty slick materials that are made for the wildland-urban interface. 5 feet critical defensible space zone. This is the thing I'm really hammering on this year, because this is what I see as what really you will have the most bang for your buck in taking care of the 5 feet that starts at the house walls and moves out for 5 feet. If you make this a non-combustible zone, you are hugely reducing your risk. So that means that in this area, you don't want anything combustible on the surface, like wood chips or redwood debris or anything like that. If you can rake back so that you're down to bare earth, you don't want to do that for far, because bare earth is not good stuff for the environment. But for that, at least that first foot, until you can figure out some other kind of less combustible surface, you can also use compost. Well-degraded compost is acceptable in there. Reduce the vegetation to just low-growing, very well-maintained plants. And make sure you don't have tall, vulnerable plants under windows or inside corners. Try not to have this, which is the sill sitting straight on the ground with the duff moving right up to it. You really need to try to get 6 inches of ground to the start of your wooden siding. That's a very important thing to do, so work on that. Just more examples of what that looks like. I just got a question about this last week, and they were asking me if they should weed eat these weeds. And I said, no, you should rake all those back from the house. The problem's not the weeds. That's where we want to go. Don't forget your stuff in your 5-foot non-combustible zone. People tend to see plants and not see their stuff. And stuff, as we saw with that broom, is highly combustible. Fences, wooden fences that attach directly to the house can wick fire up to the house. If you put a non-combustible fence element in just for 5 feet or so, that could be a metal gate, it could be a bit of chain link, whatever. That is a great thing to do too. Now this 5-foot thing is really, really important. It's really, really important. And you can do 5 feet, right? I know the rest 100 feet, most of you don't have that around that's on your property, so it all gets very difficult. But you can do your 5 feet. You absolutely can. Defensible space from the 5 feet out. Defensible space does not mean moonscape. It does not mean cutting down redwood trees. It means reducing the ladder fuels and the dead and dying plants that are out there so that the highly flammable, low-growing stuff has been moved so that the fire is low and stays on the ground and doesn't get up into the treetops and it can't walk straight to your home. You want to go in zones, start with 30 feet, get rid of the dead and dying, move that stuff, move your wood pile out if it's within 30 feet. If you don't have 30 feet to move it to, cover it with an ignition-resistant tarp. Out to zone 2, you want to lower the, this is 30 to 100 feet, you want to lower it as much as you can, get the dead and dying out. That's where we want to concentrate. Lower the fuels, get rid of the dead and dying. Clean around your propane tank, that's really important too. You don't want overhanging on your propane tank. And do look to your address signs. Is there an address sign with your number on it that's clearly visible and reflective? 80% of calls for firefighters or for medical events where finding you is really important and really has to be an easy, fast process. So this not only will help in the wildfire, but it'll help even more if you're having a medical emergency. Check your chimney screen and make sure that it's openings between 3/8 and 1/2 inch. This is what protects the fire from your house. I mean, the forest from your house. Doesn't protect your house from the forest fire, but it will protect the forest from your house starting a fire in the forest. So again, those are our priorities. I know that this presentation will be up on the web, and I know that I went way too fast to get through it, but we're back on our priorities. Priority 4 are windows, glass, windows, and doors. Glass fails roughly at 234 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 600, for annealed glass fails at 234 degrees Fahrenheit. Tempered glass, which is much better for fire, fails at 665. So what you really want are windows that are dual paned with one pane tempered. Those are WUI windows. That'll keep the glass from breaking and the fire getting in the home, and then it's off to the races. So use those WUI rated windows. Close the windows during fire season. If you're leaving and it's a red flag, scary day, close all your windows before you go. You can make covers to cover vulnerable windows. There's more on that in various places you can look at. Amy alluded to her decks, and yes, decks do have vulnerabilities. The good news, Amy, is that most fires on decks start from something that's on the deck and then grow to take the deck. So if you really pay attention to not having highly flammable items on your deck, that's one of the most important things you can do. So replace it with non-combustible if you can, and if you can't, and that's a great example. This was a house that survived in a neighborhood where no one else did, and I think this was one of the reasons. He had a beautiful tile deck. And if you can't do that, just keep it clean, and do not leave your wood pile under your wooden deck, which is, everybody does that. So keep it clean above and below. Siding is priority 6 of 6, and that's usually the first thing people think about when I say structure hardening. They think I'm going to be telling them to replace the siding. If your siding looks like this, and it's old and degraded, and there's lots of places for the embers to get in, yes, that's going to be a priority. And in full disclosure, this was my house. This was my siding, and now this is my house and my siding. Yay! So it's really important to get after the siding if it's highly vulnerable. If it's not, that 0 to 5 foot is really important because you can greatly reduce the risks of the siting by paying attention to that 0 to 5 foot non-combustible zone. At the end of the day, really, this image needs to be replaced by this image, because this isn't about a guy with a shovel saving the day when the fire comes. This is about what we do with our loppers and our screwdrivers before the fire even starts. And this is what I really like to leave folks with. This is our responsibility. I personally spend an amazing amount of time weed eating and cleaning up around my house. Here's my contact information. Let me know if any questions.
Great, thanks so much, Caerleon. That's wonderful. And what a density of information. Hopefully we can get some of that out to everyone as well, and have more materials to review. And again, there's more information in the presentation I sent a link to. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, and we're going to go ahead and move on to the last piece. As a facilitator, I hate not having time for a discussion, but in the next 2 calls, we're going to have much more interactive time. But do go ahead and write questions in the chat, and our presenters are all here. Jason Wells is on the line too, and those questions can get answered in real time as we go forward. So I'm going to hand it off to Adriana to share that video. And that would probably take us very close to 7:15, which is the time we're officially ending, but a few of us will be hanging out a little bit after the call if anyone wants to stay on just a few minutes longer.
Thanks, Katie. And I just want to mention that this video that we're about to see is something that Jason had pre-recorded, and like the rest of the presentations today will be available later. I also encourage you to turn up your volume if you have a hard time hearing this.
Good afternoon, or whatever time it is that, when you're watching this. My name is Jason Wells. I'm a registered professional forester working with Sonoma and Gold Ridge RCDs to promote better forest stewardship among non-industrial private landowners in Sonoma County. My presentation for you today will be discussing vegetation management in an urban redwood forest, with the ultimate goal of managing the wildland-urban interface for reduced wildfire risk. This presentation will briefly overview 2 major goals that are of importance to the community: fire safety and forest health. I'll spend a few minutes discussing defensible space and how modest changes in fuel connectivity can greatly improve the dynamics of a wildland fire. Then I'll spend some time discussing forest ecology, primarily focusing on how trees interact with each other and their environment and how that affects their condition. Then I'll speak a bit about how thinning a forest can improve the individual tree vigor and health within a forest. The presentation will also briefly overview some management options that are available to meet the goal of a Fire Safe Camp Meeker. The Camp Meeker community is preparing a Community Wildfire Protection Plan. A primary component of this plan will be reducing the fire risk posed by the forest vegetation embedded around and within Camp Meeker. While the forest is important to Camp Meeker's look, feel, and values as a community in the woods, the redwood forest does pose a heightened risk to public safety. Simply put, forests have a tendency to build up fine, woody materials such as small trees, dry foliage, vines, pine needles, and dead leaves. These are readily available to burn. And if these materials are near your home or your evacuation route, they'll greatly increase your risk during a wildfire. So hopefully you'll have already heard a bit about home defensible space and home hardening from Fire Safe Sonoma and Sonoma County Fire, so I'll try not to spend too much time on this topic, but its importance can't be understated when it comes to the health and safety of the forest and those who live within it. We generally think of forest fires being started by lightning or other natural causes, but the truth is that the overwhelming majority of forest fires are started inadvertently by people, just like the overwhelming majority of home fires are started by people. It's a fact that the most flammable source of fuel in an urban forest is the home, which is why reducing the flammability of the home with careful selection of building materials is so important. There are 3 necessary ingredients to any fire: oxygen, a heat or ignition source, and fuel. These ingredients make up what's known as the fire triangle. Pending any further rollbacks on environmental regulations, we can't yet eliminate oxygen from the atmosphere. We also can't control all possible ignition sources that may be present, especially in a home environment where people typically cook their food. The only part of the fire triangle that we can control in advance of a fire is the amount of fuel present on the landscape. As I previously stated, your home is the largest single source of fuel in the forest. A home fire without defensible space could easily spread to the forest environment, which could in turn burn down neighboring homes. Fuels management is all about breaking up the continuity of fuels. In the context of continuity, there are two kinds of fuels, horizontal and vertical. Horizontal fuels allow fire to move horizontally, typically along the surface of the ground, and vertical fuels allow fire to climb into the canopy. Most wildland fire is fought by disrupting the continuity of surface fuels. In other words, grass, shrubs, bushes, and down logs that could carry fire horizontally along the ground. This is done using hand tools or mobilized equipment to scrape vegetation back to bare mineral soil, which is not flammable. If instead there is a crown fire, which is a fire that moves horizontally up in the canopy of trees, that is not fightable by wildland firefighters. Public Resources Code 4291 requires 100 feet of defensible space around buildings in the wildland urban interface, or WUI. Given that fire can move horizontally and vertically where fuel is present, it's important to separate fuel sources both up in the air, like tree branches, and on the ground, like bushes, particularly where they are near a home. So what does this look like? The first 5 feet of the home should be pretty much free of any flammable material, including plants. Instead, consider rock mulch, brick, sand, or flagstone. The first 30 feet from the home can contain plants, but should be carefully maintained. Any obviously dead or dry materials should be pruned and removed. The healthy plants that remain should be planted in islands, so that fire can't easily leap along the ground from plant to plant. This might look like separating garden patches with a 5-foot bare soil pathway, for example. Tree canopies should similarly have space between them, about 15 feet, to prevent fire spreading through canopies. The next 70 feet are maintained in the same way, though a little more relaxed on spacing to disrupt horizontal continuity of fuels at both the canopy and surface levels, and to disrupt vertical continuity of fuels by removing ladder fuels. This is a larger area than the previous two, so common activities would include mowing grasses, reducing accumulated leaves and needles, thinning out small trees where they crowd larger trees, and limbing trees to 6 to 8 feet above the ground. Not just plants, but woody construction, like fences, sheds, and decks, also need attention. Here's an example home showing a wooden fence that connects directly to the home. If the fence caught fire, it could bring fire directly to the home. This could be altered by removing the wooden gate attached to the home and replacing it with a metal gate. Decks and sheds near the house should be modified to be less flammable. Another thing to note is the climbing vines and shrubs that are making their way up the large fir tree in the backyard. These are ladder fuels, and they should be removed. Another example home has a wooden fence that connects to an area underneath the awning of the roof. If the fence were to catch fire, it could spread to under the roof, which would likely lead to the home being lost. This image is also a good example of just how little space many of the homes have to the roadway. Both homes and roadways need good defensible space. It'd be advisable to reduce the vegetation and flammable materials between the two. Roadside defensible space is critical for 2 reasons. First, fire along an access road can inhibit the ability for that road to be used as an escape route. And second, cars are a major ignition source for fire. Vegetation treatments immediately adjacent to roadways can improve the safety of access routes while simultaneously limiting the availability of fuels near a major ignition source. Additionally, if roads are overgrown, firefighting personnel cannot stage near them. So now that I have covered the requisite topic of defensible space, I can begin to speak a bit more about redwood forests in general and forest health. Forest health is a subjective term, which in the world of forestry really carries little meaning without context. In short, forest health is largely dependent upon what expectations people place on a landscape. As an example, think about a major issue facing forests in other parts of the county, which is conifer encroachment of oak woodlands. Oak woodlands in Sonoma County are being encroached by Douglas fir, which takes advantage of early shade that oaks provide its seedlings. The fir trees then grow to overtop the shade of intolerant oak trees, which slowly die as the Douglas fir take away necessary sunlight. This process is called forest succession and is totally natural. The notion of whether or not that process creates a healthy forest largely depends on what your feelings are in relation to the oak trees. The Douglas fir in this scenario are certainly healthy and happy to have been able to take advantage of the situation. but the oak trees would obviously hold a different opinion. Most of our oak-dominated woodlands in California are only located where they are because they served beneficial uses to humans, who use tools like fire to cultivate a landscape that better serve their needs. Humans have been living in Sonoma County for many thousands of years, and most every native plant community in the area thrives here as a result of land management practices employed by the Native Americans who lived here. The image on display shows a redwood ecosystem dominated by large diameter, widely spaced redwood trees. The understory in the immediate foreground has largely been cleared, save for sorrel and fern, and this photo was likely taken in a park. For most people, this image conjures the idea of a relatively wet or mesic forest environment, unlikely to burn and naturally predisposed to their current condition. I'm here to tell you that this is far from the truth of the situation. This forest was not created by accident, but rather by a long history of repeated fire. It's important to note the redwood forests have evolved with regular exposure to fire. The native peoples who originally inhabited California's coast were frequently setting fire in the redwood understory to encourage certain flora and fauna to persist. You can see evidence of past fires on old-growth redwood in the form of burn scars and goose pens. The image on the right shows a tree with a large basal hollow or goose pen. These features are the result of fire which slowly carves deeper fissures into the trunk of a tree over repeated burning cycles. A study of tree cores conducted at Jackson Demonstration State Forest concluded that fire return intervals in that area were roughly once every 20 years. There may be evidence that fires on the Sonoma coast were even more frequent. This type of frequent fire clears the forest floor of dry fuels as it shifts the forest composition to larger trees, which typically have thicker insulating bark to protect them from fire. You can see in the image on the right that many of the smaller trees were killed in a recent fire. Some of the trees following this fire have fallen to the forest floor. If fires were to be applied in this area again within a few years, those dead fuels on the ground could be consumed and the forest would be left on a trajectory closer to the park-like redwood forest we first saw. One metric that is often used to determine forest health is to look at the overall growth and well-being of the individual trees within a forest. In any natural setting, there's competition among organisms for resources, and trees are no different. Trees compete with one another for light, water, and soil nutrients, which are limited. There is only a certain amount of overall growth that a given acre can support, and everything growing in that acre is competing for a chance to grow and outcompete its neighbor. Once growing space has been filled, the amount of growth that a tree can have will be limited. The image in the lower left shows the result of competition and release from competition caused by thinning out competing vegetation. Prior to the thinning operation, the annual growth rings are tightly spaced, indicating that the tree was not growing much per year. After the thinning, the growth rings are more widely spaced, indicating that the annual growth is increased. It's also important to note that larger trees require more space than smaller trees. An acre can likely support hundreds of 5-inch trees, but may only be able to support a few dozen 50-inch trees. An acre can likely support hundreds of 5-inch trees, but may only be able to support a few dozen 50-inch trees. When trees are well spaced, they're more resilient to forest pests and disease. For example, as we approach drought conditions, water is a limited resource. Densely packed, small diameter forests take up much more water than widely spaced large trees. This is because there is a much higher amount of relative leaf area in small diameter forests than in large ones, and leaves are where water is lost in trees. This is because there is a much higher amount of relative leaf area in a small diameter forest than a large one, and leaves are where water is lost in trees. This image shows a dead tan oak tree, which presumably died from sudden oak death. There is no real cure for sudden oak death, which is a water mold. But as with any forest pathogen, it's expected that stressed trees are far more likely to die than those which grow freely. Hopefully this talk up to this point has made it clear that thinning trees and managing tree density is a necessary part of managing a forest. Considering that we, as a species, have been managing our surroundings for millennia, and now that we've discussed how thinning can be beneficial to the residual forest stand, I'd like to take another look at the Camp Meeker forest. Obviously we can see here that this area has been heavily modified since ancient times. There are roads and cars and houses. It's important to note that this area has been logged before, and we're not dealing with a forest that was shaped by the native peoples, but rather by a single large-scale disturbance event, namely logging, with little focused management following. You can see in this photo that there's a significant amount of understory vegetation that's built up, And if it were to burn, it would cause a problem for the forest and the human infrastructure. I hope that you can see or start to see what this area might look like if the small trees were removed near the urban infrastructure of Camp Meeker. And I hope you understand that in the context of a redwood forest, the removal of these trees is not detrimental. Back to the image of the park-like redwood ecosystem from before, and remember that it took considerable work and time to get the forest to look like that. So outside of burning, which was the tool of the Sonoma County natives, what options do we really have to make the forest feel more like the old-growth park? As these images show, it really comes down to light thinning and pruning work. This work is labor-intensive, and as we know, things grow back when you cut them down, which means there will need to be maintenance. Primarily in this area, trees under 6 to 8 inches in diameter should be considered for removal, or at the very least, they should have the lower branches removed to a height of at least 8 feet off the ground. A lot of the vines and dead woody material will need to be cut down and chipped or burned in piles. It's going to take a community effort to make Camp Meeker safe from fire, but there's no reason ecologically why we shouldn't be able to make that effort. So I'm hoping that this presentation has granted you a bit of social license to proactively manage the forest surrounding Camp Meeker for the good of a fire-safe community and a healthy forest. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach me with the info below. I also encourage you to participate in the public meetings hosted by Fire Safe Camp Meeker. Thank you for making Camp Meeker fire safe.
Great, thank you so much. And Adriana, I'll let you have the last word here. Just want to let folks off the hook who have to dash away. But Adriana, why don't you go ahead and
thanks, Katy.
Yeah,
I think a great last message would just be to thank you again for coming. It's really wonderful to see everyone here and to be able to cover these topics. And I think Katy was going to throw up a slide for us that it's a collaborative slide that we can all add to say, you know, what topics we might be interested in working on as we move forward. And then I also want to just invite you all to stay on the line. We can stay on until 7:30 or even later to do Q&A. I'm sure there are some questions after we've talked about 3 heavy topics. So please feel free to stay. And Katy now is going to bring up those collaborative slides for us. Those are also, so we're going to watch the slide live through her screen share, but if you want to access the slide to actually write your name to say that you're interested in helping with, you know, getting involved with Camp Meeker, community or event organizing neighborhood groups, which can be, you know, really great kind of pods for organizing locally. If you want to help us gather information about the local history of Camp Meeker, which we will definitely need for the CWPP, or if you're someone who wants to get out on the ground and do community mapping to say, like, hey, there's you know, a bridge here in the community that could be an evacuation issue, or did you know about this hazard? That would be really helpful. And lastly, you know, folks who want to band together and do some fuels reduction work, plan out those vegetation management projects. That would be great. So the link to the slide itself is pasted in our chat. Katy Mamen just put that in. And yeah, she said, please type your name on the last slide on the file if you'd like more information about helping with the Wildfire Protection Plan. So please, you know, take a moment to access that, write down your name next to something you're interested in. And then if you have questions for the presenters, write your question in the chat and we will take those questions from the chat. So hopefully we can do both at once.
And I would also say, if anyone, feel free to unmute yourself. We're just, we're past our official end of the meeting, but we'll be hanging around if you have questions or want to be talking more. It'd be great to hear from you verbally or via the chat.
I joined, but I made it. Lazarus.
Hi, Sam. I'm so glad you can make it.
Hello. I couldn't find the link at first, so I made it though.
Oh, that's wonderful. Great. Okay. Well, this is good to have Sam here available to answer any questions. And Sam, did you want to say anything about this process?
Just going forward, I think
really great of you for that.
you were hitting was right on. Just trying to get community involvement, identifying the hazard spots and things where we want to move forward. That's kind of key in this process right now.
Great, thank you. All right, questions, anyone? Don't be shy. I guess I'll say that we will make this presentation available later for those who want to reference it.
I have my hand up.
Oh, Amy, go ahead.
I wanted to say two things. One was that I just wanted to mention Fire Safe Occidental and say that we're totally supportive of them and they're supportive of us. We feel that Camp Meeker has some unique attributes that which is one of the reasons we created Fire Safe Camp Meeker, as well as having a Fire Safe Occidental. Am I saying their name right? Anyway, I just wanted to mention that. So if you hear about Fire Safe Occidental, it's we're totally willing and happy to work with them and for them to work with us. So I wanted to mention that. And then also I wanted to say that I just the other day, my husband found an arrowhead under our house in the dirt. And it was just a reminder that, yeah, indeed, people have lived in this forest for, we don't know how long, but we know thousands of years in this and have been inhabited in this area. So just wanted to mention the people that came before us. So thank you.
Linnea Tennyson here. And I just wanted to quickly say, I am still on the volunteer fire department board, and unfortunately Richard is not. He's off to other lands, but we certainly have had numerous discussions about how we're going to interface with Fire Safe Camp Meeker, and that's all of the volunteers know what they're going to do in case of a wildfire, and certainly evacuation and getting people to be safe is one of them, but also interfacing with your organization, I think, is really important. And I kind of see myself taking on that role with the board. I thank you, Amy. So I hope to be working much closer with you guys in the future.
Great.
Yeah, and of course, again, kind of with the fire department thought in mind, fuel reduction is going to be probably a real emphasis.
Thanks, Linnea.
For them, for us.
Great to hear from you. Any last questions before we wrap up?
Yes, I have one.
Please, Lynn.
I'm Lynn, and I've lived here actually 52 years. So I lived here when I was young, started a family. My kids are now starting in their 50s. My question is the county going to help in terms of this plan, besides clearing the land, improving our roads? We would have a horrible time trying to evacuate given the situation in our roads at the moment. Some are caving in, they're too narrow. We're not going to get fire equipment up here if we're going to try to get out at the same time. So is that part of what is going to happen, to look at accessing and also being able to maneuver out?
I can jump in on that one briefly. The first is that this is a plan which will identify things that the community wants to have happen and quantifies the risk. I don't think anybody who's driven in Camp Meeker can miss that the narrow road infrastructure and heavy vegetation is a problem. The road infrastructure, the size of the roads, the curves, the blindness, there's really very little that can be done about that because the houses sit right on the road. And so I think that one of the things that we need to really focus on as we move forward in this are what are the things that we can do to improve the situation that exists. And I think a lot of the solutions for roadside vegetation one of the best places to look would be, can we get the community to take some of those projects on themselves? But it will be a focus of discussion, but the plan does not directly cause action. It's a plan saying this is what we'd like to see happen and these are what we see the risks as.
The other
one of the things, you know, and this is not a cure for that problem because it's a huge community problem and it's not gonna fix, you know, a fire truck trying to squeeze between two big redwood trees. But, you know, I've spent 4 weekends with a friend cleaning off the bridge and starting up around Anderson Hall. And it's a street, which I am not gonna take on. The ivy is 2 feet into the road. That's like deteriorating the road. So it's one of those things like your own defensible space. Everybody should go out and look at their own road and say, oh my God, you know, the road is actually 2 feet wider. But, you know, because of wash down the hills, piling up, the ivy, suddenly it's not. And that ivy is just deteriorating the pavement. So really underneath some of that stuff, our roads are a lot better than they look.
The other question I have is some of the trees on lots should come down, except they're holding up the hill. We have a case where the county deserted a road and it is basically caving in. And without those trees, this hill would go. So what are might be some of those solutions?
Right, so these are just the kind of issues and questions we're going to be digging into on the next 2 calls. I don't know if anyone wants to address that quickly now, but we will have more time to do a full scan.
I want to say something. I think that this directly relates to the mapping section. Like, we do need people to go out and just identify where are the trees, so that as we move forward, we can begin to target whatever resources we can come up with in the most effective way. So that mapping, where we start looking at where are the roads deteriorated, what trees might be able to be taken out to make the roads wider. So just that's going to be an important aspect of the plan, is coming up with you know, those dangerous conditions, so that we can address them. So thank you.
Great. Okay, good. Well, let's put a bookmark in it there for tonight. Thanks so much for staying on. It's great to see so many people still here 10 minutes after our official finish. I think that really suggests to me that we're all really hungering to dig deeper into these issues. Thank you again so much to our presenters. That was just so informative, and yeah, it would be great to dig in next week, same time, same place. It's the same link. 6 p.m. we'll be getting on and having more interaction together to look at our risks around Camp Meeker. Adriana?
Thanks, Katie. I think that sums it up perfectly. And again, you know, join us next week, next Thursday at 6, and the following Thursday at 6 to keep this conversation going. The next ones, like Katie said earlier, are going to be much more interactive, and we'll be able to bring up all of these thoughts and concerns and have a rich discussion about it. So thanks, everyone.
And Amy's saying invite your neighbors. It'd be great to get some other folks on the call.
Yes, invite your neighbors. You know, we have a Facebook page set up for these events that you can easily share online, but also just give them a call. I think the people-to-people interaction is really impactful. Okay, well, thanks again,
all.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Good night.